I think we should play some Bjork right at the start of this episode, the Icelandic singer, because she very definitely has a distinctive voice. And that's what we're going to be talking about in Pele's poetry podcast today, voice. And Pele, I get it when it comes to a singer. I can hear her sort of ululating, if that's the right word, a very, as I say, distinctive voice. But I don't really kind of get this whole concept of a poetic voice and finding one's voice. So how would you define the voice of a poet?
To definitely not think of your voice as poetic at any point. Poetry, the writing of it, as I think we've alluded to in our other episodes, and we will keep on repeating ourselves in different ways, as all good poems do, is about your connection to things and how much truth you can draw from that relationship, a very private relationship that you find to the object or experience inside yourself or memory. So there's a little metaphor that I have been keeping under my hat about Dylan Thomas and his best friend Vernon Watkins. I know, Rich, you love Dylan Thomas, and I think I have told you this anecdote. Vernon Watkins was a fantastic, also fantastically talented poet, but much more modest, lived his life inside himself, where Dylan Thomas lived his outside himself. And they used to like going to the pub together. Both Welsh poets, Vernon Watkins from Cardiff, and would have been made poet laureate if he hadn't died as soon as he did. And they were walking along in the middle of the night after the pub had shut. They were probably both a bit pissed. And Vernon trips over in the dark. And Dylan Thomas goes to help him up, but after he's helped him up, he shines his torch on the ground to see what it is that Vernon Watkins had tripped up on. And he sees that it's a feather. Vernon Watkins, in true Vernon Watkins style, has tripped on a mere feather. Now, to me, that is a metaphor for writing poetry. And I was thinking, what is the metaphor? What is that exactly in that moment? Where's the poetry? And I realised that it's not the fact that Vernon Watkins tripped on a feather, but it was Dylan Thomas's need to see what it was that he had tripped up on. That's where the poem is, where the action lives. That's where your voice is. The world is showing you your voice. Every day something will occur if you're in the poetry zone that will define you and your growing voice. It's like every day the world sends you a text message somewhere in your day that shows you where your voice is going.
So it's a lovely story, by the way, and tripping over a feather takes some doing, but clearly, as you've suggested, they were 3 or 4 sheets to the wind. That it is the poet's take on the world. It's their take rather than the style, or is it a combination of style, which might include word choice, syntax, rhyme, line length, all of those things that are perhaps more obvious, and their take. So is voice a combination of that take on the world and style, or is style a completely different thing?
I think, I'm sorry to use the word toolkit, much overused these days, but it's unavoidable in this instance because those are key elements. In fact, let's call them keys rather than tools. To me, those are the keys that you use to open the door of doors into your own voice, but they're not the voice itself. No way. And you do get some very chilly, hard, cold poetry that is perfectly tuned according to those things, but the soul is missing. There's no feather on the floor.
I have to admit that when you first started talking about voice, we started talking about voice 2 or 3 more years ago now, I kind of didn't really get it initially. And you encouraged me to read other poets widely, which of course I did as a diligent student. And that kind of led me to think, well, hang on a minute, isn't all poetry going to be derivative in the sense that you are taking a bit of Thomas, you're taking a bit of Don Patterson, you're taking a bit of whoever and mixing it all together. So your own voice is necessarily going to be a composition of lots of other voices and therefore not unique, not your own voice. And And then slowly, perhaps you cast off all of those other influences and do find a voice that is your own. So I've chosen a piece that we can come back to in due course that I think was the beginning of I'm not going to say a unique voice because just like toolkit, there's another expression that's overused, but an unusual voice, perhaps an unusual take. But
Yeah.
come on, tell me about the greats. Who can we look forward to great wise?
Okay. Well, obviously, there are so many, and aren't we lucky? It's like the minute you open the first book of anthology of poetry, you realise you're in the company of treasure. And that the treasure is endless, endless. It's an endless box of treasure. So thanks to the greats for that, for how they've endured, and for the people who've paid them attention, so they have been able to endure. So I had to choose, and I've just authored or helped to bring into existence this women's poetry series published by Gemini Books. I was asked to write the introductions and analysis for four of the great female voices in modern history. And so I've chosen two from those books partly because I want to mention them, because they are quite the most beautiful looking poetry books I've seen in the past 15 years, and it's so lovely to be included. And secondly, because it did bring me very close to these women poets. I had to understand them so much better than I have had to understand a poet before, because writing a poet down as an introductory thing rather than an impressionable inspirational thing is a completely different. The first is I chose two, and I want to read two very short poems by each of them, because I think one of the poets is a great unique voice, and the other one, who was much more famous in her time, is a very accomplished and entertaining voice. And I thought it might be interesting for you as listeners, and for me and Rich, to just marvel at the difference of the genius to the great. So, Edna St. Vincent Millay was born 50 years after Emily Dickinson into American society. She was part of the Roaring Twenties, and she picked up almost where Emily Dickinson had left off and became one of the most famous poets in the world. Great, and that she was a female as well. Thomas Hardy said there were only two good things to come out of America. One was the skyscraper, and the other was Edna St. Vincent Millay. So imagine the height of her fame. And she would write these beautiful sonnets and very short-formed pieces of work, brought about by the extraordinary genius that was her precursor, Emily Dickinson, who must have cleared the way for this confidence in Edna St. Vincent Millay to write about her sex life in these sonnets, and to write these very conversational, very alarming, beautiful poems, which she would recite in her gold dress into these halls filled with crowds of people who'd come to see her. So her most famous short work is about a candle flame. I'm just getting up on I don't know, I should know it off by heart, but I don't. And it's from one of her collections. She was very prolific. From a few figs from thistles. This is called First Fig. My candle burns at both ends. It will not last the night. But my foes, and oh, my friends, it gives a lovely light. Now, that was an extraordinarily popular anecdotal poem of its time. Now, before that, in Amherst, Massachusetts, a solitary woman without halls or gold dresses or any real friends at all, apart from a few very profound ones, was writing some of the greatest poetry ever written, and was inventing poetry in a new form, and so making poetry become something else. And people say that if it hadn't been for her solitary and her deep spirituality and the fact she hardly ever left the house, these poems would never have been born. And they weren't born until after she died, because nobody really knew about her as a poet until they found her poems in a big chest at the end of her bed and realised that they'd walked in on one of the greatest poets of all time. So this is also a short poem, and I just like everyone to listen to the difference. Perhaps the solidity, the architectural power, the feeling between the spaces of this far, I think, greater poet. It's number 249, and it's the great erotic poem that she wrote. Wild nights, were I with thee, wild nights should be our luxury. Futile the winds to a heart in port, done with the compass, done with the chart. Rowing in Eden, the sea, might I but more tonight in thee.
The first, lean, spare, but beautiful. Dare I say, because she's talking about candlelight and burning a candle at both ends, that it was illuminating, but that's to rather cheapen it with a trite remark. But I think a part of a voice, and it is apparent in the second one as well, is that, yes, it's their take on something, Wild Nights, in both cases, in some respects, but how they choose to articulate that in very few words. So it is something to do with word choice and how those words are put together. Is that syntax? I think it is, isn't it? But it's more than that. It is, as you said at the outset, their take on something which I haven't heard anybody else talk about those things in quite such a beautiful way. So it's lean and spare and beautiful at the same time.
Yes, I think, as always with every single poet and poem, it's not the poem itself, it's what's going on behind the poem, around the poem, above the poem, inside the heart of the engineer or the maker of the poem. So Emily Dickinson, she wouldn't have been able to help it. But her poem has a depth and richness that Edna St. Vincent Millay's lacks. And, I think if we're talking about voice, she's built up a residue, an elixir, an understanding, a dedication that Edna St. Vincent Millay never managed to do. Her dedication came from a different source, which was to promote poetry and the woman in poetry, and to, shout it from the rooftops. Emily Dickinson was building the rooftops for the poets, especially the female ones who came after her.
But also building that experience that contributes to your overall voice as a poet and to the voice of a particular poem. Here's a question for you. You don't have to answer if you don't want to. You can take the fifth. Just imagine a world in which there was a famous poem uncovered, but no one was quite sure. Certainly you and I were ignorant of the writer, and then we heard it. Could we tell who it was written by from the voice alone? In other words, if you were to be handed a manuscript and somebody was to say, I'm not going to tell you who wrote this, could you tell it was, for example, Emily Dickinson, if it was written in her voice?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and it's a great edit question, because basically, in my humble opinion, the greater the poet, the easier it is to tell that it's by them. A bit like paintings, really. I mean, you can tell a Rembrandt or a Van Gogh the minute you walk in the museum. Not so easy for lesser poets. Why is that? Because they can compose something that is so utterly their own. How do they do that? A lot of work, a lot of love, a lot of pain, and a lot of understanding the works that went before them, both poetry and painting.
I've brought a couple of pieces along. I'm going to spring this one on you, Pele,
This by
because
Uridge.
no, 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 no. Yeah, we're getting there. We'll get to the also rans after we've got through the greats. You and I both have a very, very high opinion of this fella, the late Michael Donaghy, the American, Irish American poet who sadly died far too young, but not before writing what I consider to be poetry with a very, very clear voice and something. I'm not going to use that word unique, but certainly a very unusual voice. But before I read the piece that I've chosen, because it helped me in my uh, finding of a voice, you knew Michael Donaghy, didn't you? You were privileged to meet him when he was living and working in London, and you were in London too. So give us a bit of an insight on the man.
Yeah, I mean, when I was a young poet in my 20s in London, we knew all the great up and coming poets: Michael Donaghy, Don Patterson, Tom Paulin, um, Hugo Williams. We used to hang out in the same pubs. They used to teach us. Um, there was no boundary. These guys were charismatic guys, they wanted to go to the pub, they wanted to tell, lots of beautiful young women and, keen, eager, talented blokes, just as talented blokes, their secrets. And you never forget the feeling of Michael Donaghy. He took me to one of his readings one night, miles out of town. And I went, I would have done anything he said. And he stood on that stage and he recited this poem completely by heart. No paper, no shuffling, hardly any introduction. That's all I have to say about him. He took our breath away, whether he was in the pub or standing reciting one of his great works. You have to read, the poems are spiritual, musical, profound. They talk right at you. You don't need to be watching him on the stage to feel him there. Just open one of the pages and he'll jump out at you. Yeah.
And at that early stage, we're talking what, 30 years ago, was his voice well developed already by then? Or listening to him reading him subsequently, did you get a sense that here was a voice in in progress, a developing voice? Because that's one of my other questions: is when you find your voice, is that it? You found your voice. Hallelujah! I found my voice, and then you stick with that same voice throughout the rest of your poetry, or is it something that is constantly changing, growing, going in different directions as you see fit?
Well, it seems I'm full of anecdotes today, but as you know, I did Andrew Motion's creative writing MA at UEA. He told me to stop trying to write like Philip Larkin. So he said, go away and write like yourself. And as I say to all my students, I'm still learning to do that. It's never finished. What you hear of yourself when you speak, what you write down about yourself when you write, what you read of other people, what they teach you, there is no way it could ever be finished if you're in the veins of the blood of poetry. It's a lifelong joy.
And if you were looking then at a poet with a long lifespan as a poet, you could compare and contrast the voice that they had at the beginning to the voice they have at the end of their career. And that would be two quite distinct voices, connected, but sufficiently different to see that development over 10, 20, 30, 40 years.
Yeah, I mean, Rich, you've read a lot of Dylan Thomas. How do you think his poems compare from a young man to, well,
He was still a young man.
a
He died
less
so
young
young.
man who died of alcoholism,
Yeah.
but was very much more famous than he'd been? Things affect your voice, your renown, your old age, your penury, your madness. All these things come to visit some poets. Which one's going to come and find you, and how are you going to write differently accordingly? It's like saying that a fire, I'm looking at a fire in this room, stays the same. The wind comes in through the doors, the flames fade, the logs run out. You have to keep writing that fire. It's a metaphor for a poet's life.
Nice way of looking at it. I've chosen a piece from Michael Donaghy's book,
Oh,
Conjure,
good. You're going to read one.
Conjure or Conjure. I'm never sure whether it should be Conjure or Conjure. When the
Conjure.
Conjure, there we go, Conjure. right? And this is not
I'm
knowing.
sure.
And I've there's a little yellow post-it note with some faded writing on it. Must be 3 or 4 years old at the very least. And I've put there, and I think this was a note that you and I made in a lesson 2 or 3 years ago. And I've written, "Who knew you could make a poem about a stinky old coat?" Question mark, exclamation. So this is a poem at one level about a stinky old coat, not knowing the words. Before he wearied of the task, he sang a nightly mass for the repose of the souls of the faithful departed, and magicked his blood to bourbon and tears over the ring, the lock of hair, the dry pink dentures. Was he talking to her? I never learned. Walk in, he'd pretend to be humming softly, like wind through a window frame. The last I saw of him alive, he pressed me to his coat. It stinks in a sack in my attic like a drowned Alsatian. It's his silence. Am I talking to him now as I get it out and pull its damp night down about my shoulders? Shall I take up the task and fill its tweedy skin? Do I stand here not knowing the words when someone walks in?
Fabulous. Why do you love that poem so much, Rich?
I imagine he was talking about his father. It's not obvious, but I imagine that's who he's talking about. Um, and his father remembering his late wife, perhaps, so perhaps his mother. I mean, I don't know, but there's something about the privacy of grief, about keeping your mouth shut when someone walks in, because grief can be something that disturbs other people. And he has conjured that up, that thought up really, really well in a very distinct voice. Um, and it gave me permission to, I think, begin to find a voice to write about things that are kind of uncomfortable and that put other people off, potentially, even put the writer off.
What do you mean permission? Did you ever feel that poetry wasn't allowed or truth wasn't allowed? Or what was it that you needed permission for? And do you still need it?
Yes and no. I feel I need it less, but I think there is always in the back of one's mind a feeling, how will this be received? And whether that then leads to self censorship, or whether you have to guard against that and be brutally honest with your thoughts and feelings. In other words, to give full voice to your voice, if that makes sense. I'm
Hmm.
not entirely sure, but I guess it's also around confidence, isn't it? The more you write, uh, the more you read, the more you perform and read your own poetry and indeed that of others, the more confident you become.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, as a kid, I can remember because this seems to be, the subtitle of this. If the main title is voice, the subtitle could be anecdotes, couldn't it? The anecdote edition. I can remember, being asked to stand up at Sunday school and sing a solo once in Royal David City. And I was just so hamstrung with nerves that I could barely get beyond the first few lines of Once in Royal David City. And I could feel my whole body, not just my face blushing, but my knees. I was wearing shorts because that was the age I was. That was the era I was singing in. And my legs blushed. And then I think I just burst into tears and ran back to, sit with mum and dad in the cheap seats in the body of the church. And I kind of still feel that a little bit, that it's something slightly embarrassing about performing or writing something for public consumption, and therefore putting on a slightly quiet voice rather than an authentic voice, which sometimes needs to be bloody loud and shouted from the rooftops.
I think sometimes, you have to trick yourself, or sometimes you don't have the choice anyway. I mean, I've never written a poem thinking that it was going to be read by anyone else, apart from my mistress account, obviously. But before that, um, everything I wrote was just, as I mentioned the other week, a letter to myself or to a world that I didn't have to see or to a world that would never get the letter. And I think, that's how to find your voice as well. Don't think about your reader don't think about it being read, but think about your reader. How can you keep yourself clear enough for them to eventually stumble upon it and maybe read it? But in the end, it belongs to you, the writer, until the moment of its completion has occurred. And that may never happen, and that's okay. Don't think about it having been born before it's even written.
Yes, a premature birth. Well, Michael Donaghy, and the piece I've just read in particular, but some other beautiful pieces in that small collection called Conjure, gave me, I think, the impetus or the confidence to write something that I know you'll agree, but I hope others agree, it has a particular voice.
Where did it come from inside you? How did it happen?
Uh, It happened, well, as it will become clear from the first line or two. It's something that's been 22 years, so it was a long pregnancy. If we're talking about giving birth to a poem, so I guess there's something that's been eating away or nagging away, or I've been thinking about for years. And as people who've listened to the first 2 or 3 episodes of Pele's poetry podcast will know, my background was, I should say, really now as a journalist. And I find it quite easy to write about things, even those that involve me journalistically. I find it much harder to write something in that sort of slightly more removed or abstracted way that poetry looks at things. But poetry can explore things that journalism can't. So it took a long time to get to this point. It's called The Father, the Son, and the Surgical Spirit. And it begins with a reference to Beowulf, Seamus Heaney's translation. Wuldrus Wieldend Worldair Forgief. Take as long as you like. He's ready for you. Shit and surgical spirit. There, I've said it. It's only taken 22 years, a forehead kissed, no words, no tears, 2 airless, 2 chests deflated, his dressed in half Windsor knotted, Sunday best, but on a Thursday, curated. Dead cool, the book tented open at line 17, steepled where his stomach would have been, his word diminished, unfinished, small, eviscerated. I can magic all this back, Son, Father, Holy Ghost, but it's the shit and the spirit I remember the most. That and the piped music, bland enough not to wake the dead. Go up to his room. He's waiting for you, she said. The print of him was already smudged at the edges of the unmade bed, sheep hollow filling with snow, so by morning there'd be nothing left to show, except a Bible-shaped drift, undisturbed, pure white, an allegorical rift between Christian and pagan, Beowulf stabbed with a pencil, marked thus by heart, line 17, now in the other scene. Morning, curtains open shut, then close, blinking behind the veil as book and body burned. The glorious Almighty made this man renowned.
It's a spectacular poem. I mean, I think just my comment about voice after hearing it again, such a pleasure to hear it again, is that it reminds me how unpoetry a really great poem is. There's nothing poetic about that poem except the way in which you stepped away from looking at your father's dead body and let the language flood in and let the truth bring the language in with it. And I know you'll tell me that tell me please, as you wrote that, did you feel the image come before you and then the language help you to write it? Or how did that beautiful image of your dead father gain such ground and such meaning and such originality, such voice?
It was very graphical as a scene in my mind's eye. and I guess it has sort of seared in at the time, and then perhaps shut out, as things like that often are. And then it keeps coming back, doesn't it? And each time it comes back slightly stronger, so you can't shut it out. And in the end, you have to do something with it. And that was when the words helped provide some shape and meaning to the images. I think it did take, I mean, I haven't read that since, not long after it was written, actually. So is that something that's 22 years in the making? I mean, I don't know. Perhaps it is. Perhaps distance, and I'm talking about time rather than literal sort of physical distance. Perhaps time is something that one needs in order for something to properly take shape in your mind. Maybe there is, something about birth here, and the gestation period can be, years and years and years and years rather than the standard 9 months of a human baby.
Things trigger memory, don't they? A conversation or a dream or reading a book by somebody else makes you, brings back something to you in a parcel, and it floats and then it goes away again, and the job of the poet is to take that image that has revisited them and put it down, using a pen, and almost release it, don't you, when you
That's
do that?
certainly that's certainly a good word, release. It does feel like a release when a poem finally comes out. I mentioned at the start that I'd got two or three books open here on my desk. We've mentioned Michael Donaghy. Um, I mentioned in passing Don Patterson. I think you've mentioned him as well. But before we go, I must just read you this really, really short piece by a poem I don't think you've heard of called Alan Buckley. And it's from a fairly recent collection called Still that he put together over the various lockdowns of COVID. So we're talking something that perhaps started nearly 6 years ago and then was a couple of years in the making. The book was published in the middle of last year. The book, as I say, called Still. Um, and this is a poem called Ground. And incidentally, not only has he got a very distinctive voice, he's also invented a poetic form, a rhyme structure that he calls douzaine. So it's one, two, three, four, five, six verses, six couplets, so six two-line verses, and each line has 7 syllables. So it's quite an unusual form. Well, he invented it. This is called Ground, and it starts with a quote from Bill Shankly. Someone said to me, "To you, football is a matter of life or death." And I said, "Listen, it's more important than that. One pitch, but many nations. I recognize the false nine, LFC shirt, his diamond smile, pure Bobby Firmino. From back when I worked with young refugees, we're in Marsh Park, not Anfield, and yet for him, this space is no less sacred. He pivots, picks up a sharp cross, shoots, scores. No one can seize this ground from under him or say he doesn't belong here."
Gorgeous. And a football poem, my favourite.
Of course, Pele.
I've
Hey,
been trying to write the great poem about Pele my whole life.
is it there?
Never.
Oh, you never know. You never know. It's never too late until it's too late. We've had some lovely feedback, haven't we? This is what, episode 4, and we must stop soon because you know what? We've been talking for 40 minutes, and our aspiration is to, chat for 30 minutes or so and not to overstay our welcome. But we can't go without mentioning how wonderfully well received the first 3 episodes have been. Very lovely to hear your voice and Pele's. And there's a couple of questions in this bit of feedback, but the listener gives us 9.5 out of 10. We'll take that, won't we?
That's great. Brilliant. Yeah.
Couple of constructive points as to why we haven't got 10 out of 10. And this is a point that others have made as well, that we perhaps should be a little bit more explicit at the start of where we're heading, because if people are going to invest half an hour or so with us, they need to know where they're heading before we take them there to an
Well, we
extent.
don't know where we're heading, so I
Yeah,
don't know.
we told them that we were going to quote some Emily Dickinson, and Michael Donaghy and Alan Buckley. What we do, as regular listeners will know, is we put the poems that we've quoted and the poets that we've quoted on the program notes page at pelecox.com. So if people want to hear more, learn more about the poems, read them again themselves in their own voice, that's absolutely fantastic. But head to pelecox.com in order to do that.
Great. I'd just like to say that I do understand about knowing where you are and things being mapped. Um, and it's really important that, you learn what you're learning, of course, and that we know what we're saying. But there is a strand to this podcast, which I think is about the spontaneity of the heart, born of the same spontaneity of the heart that a poem comes from. And not to sound pretentious, but, we don't plan or script these necessarily. They are born of, two minds and hearts interacting with this wonderful, wonderful magic that is language and poetry. So forgive us if sometimes we get a bit lost, but it's just about joy and it's just about magic, which is where we want to come from. So there's my answer.
That's a good answer. And getting lost is good, getting lost isn't a bad thing. Getting lost is a good thing.
In this terrible world where so much is trained and tracked and planned and sold to us, let's unsell ourselves and not quite know where we're going.
That's been my whole life.
And me.